Riot just released the largest patch for set 10, with many changes to various traits, units, and items that has completely shifted the meta. I'm GM Blue, rank 433, unfortunately not rank 1, but I hopefully know enough to help you get into the patch and learn it, starting off with the early game. Let's talk about early game headliners in patch 14.1, starting off with the 1 cost. In S tier, we have Annie, Nami, Taric, and Olaf. Annie got reworked so that her primary target of her ability takes a lot more damage. They did compensate nerf her and reduce the amount of increased attack speed she got after casting her ability, and they also decreased the amount of damage that her secondary fireball would do after casting her ability 4 times. However, in the early game, this is a massive buff. She is going to kill a lot more units because of the increased damage to her primary target. It doesn't matter what items you put onto her, and they also buffed 2 emo so that it gives 20 mana on ally death instead of 10, so she's casting a lot more frequently. Trust me when I say Annie belongs in S tier for AP item holders. And then we have Nami. They reduced her maximum mana pool from 75 down to 60. This means that the number of autos that she takes per cast went down from 8 to 6 if you don't have a mana item. If you have Spear of Shojin, it went from 5 autos down to 4 autos, so a massive buff here when it comes to Nami in terms of how frequently she's casting. That's very important because one of the major issues with this unit was she would often cast on a unit that was almost dead already, or even cast on a unit that was dead and she just completely wasted her ability. On top of that, they reduced the time that she's mana locked after casting her ability, so any attack speed items mean that she's going to be able to cast even more frequently on top of the mana buff. And to compensate nerf for this, they slightly reduced the stun duration of her ability, but trust me when I say she's a lot stronger in the early game now. You can actually use her as an AP item holder. For Taric, they increased the amount of damage that he does after casting his ability and auto attacking. It does anywhere between roughly like 300 to 500 damage from my personal experience, and it is not going to be that big of a surprise if Taric ends up being your top damage if you don't have another seriously itemized carry on your board, especially if you have something like Crown Guard or Ionic Spark on your Taric. He will actually do some serious work here in the early game. First, his damage is negligible as you go later on in the game, but if we're talking specifically stage 2 here, he actually does some serious damage. For Olaf, this is the strongest AD item holder that exists in stage 2, in my opinion. He's very difficult to kill if you don't have a lot of single target. The only thing that really counters Olaf at this point in time is Nami, so it's kind of unfortunate that she's part of the meta. However, even if you are fighting against the Nami, if you have some good AD items onto the Olaf, then he's practically unkillable in the early game here, especially if you have like Pentakill and Bruiser also in at the same time. He is very tanky and very strong, does a lot of damage, and he can item hold for Yone, item hold for Riven, item hold for Twitch if you're playing Twin Terror. Any of the AD items can go onto this Olaf, and he'll do a lot of work for you. Now we go into A tier here. So Cassante, still really good with Heartsteel. Yasuo, really good if you're playing Yasuo reroll, or just as a melee carry for either Riven or Yone. Corki is still the best AD item holder at ranged, although they did nerf his ability damage scaling with attack damage, so, and it's pretty noticeable here because the way they compensate buffed him is they increase the strength of 8-bit, but you don't have a lot of 8-bit stacks in the early game, and sometimes you don't have 8-bit at all, so he actually feels noticeably weaker here than he did in prior patches. Then we go into B tier here. These are all suboptimal in my opinion. You really shouldn't play these headliners unless it's really good for your spot, with the exception of Tahm Kench here. Tahm Kench, if you have an early Urgot or Samira and you have country, then you should definitely pick up Tahm Kench because the country opener is quite strong. All right, let's quickly talk about 2 cost headliners here, starting off with Gragas. This is an extension of Disco Dazzlers. We already saw that Taric and Nami were in S tier just because Disco Dazzlers is so strong. Same thing here with Gragas. They buffed his ability damage, not relevant for stage 4 and beyond, but in stage 3 and 2 when you're actually playing Gragas, he actually can do quite a bit of damage if you have some good tank items onto him. Just generally quite strong with the Disco Dazzler opener. Then we have Kayle. They buffed her ability damage by quite a bit. It's quite noticeable. I actually think she's relatively flexible, meaning that you can pretty much put her on any board. So you can even put her on the Disco Dazzler board as an AP item holder, and she'll actually do some work here pretty much no matter what. So regardless of what traits you have active for her, ideally you do get active whatever trait you have as her headliner. So if you have Pentakill, throw a Mordekaiser on your board. If you have Edgelord, throw any Edgelord on your board. It really doesn't matter what it is, but try to give her at least one of her 2 traits, and she'll do a lot of work with any AP items that you give her. Then you have Senna. She continues to be a strong AP item holder. That's always been true. She's very dependent on her traits, meaning that you need to have both true damage and rapid fire for her really to do anything, and that sort of restricts her overall power level. In fact, I think that's a big part of why we're seeing a lot less Senna now than we saw in last patch, despite the fact that there were no changes made to her ability or her base stats. Let's go into A tier here, and we're going to move through this really quickly here. So Aphelios is Heartsteel, always good. Bard, really good with the Disco Dazzler board. You can play him as a backline carry. Garen, just a generically strong tank. Gnar is an excellent melee carry if you need it. And then Seraphine, I've seen some people play this as an AP carry in the Disco Dazzler board if you absolutely need one. I will say that I think she's noticeably weaker than the other AP carry options, and I don't think she performs that well in her standard KDA Superfan board from what I've seen, but a lot of people have been playing her. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and put her into A tier. And then we move into B tier. So Kai'Sa is really good in the Superfan Jazz sort of setup, but outside of that, I tend to think that she's been sort of lackluster in my opinion. Twitch is really only good in Twin Terror. Outside of that, I find that he's not that strong, so he's S tier if it's Twin Terror, and if it's not Twin Terror, I keep him in B tier here. Pantheon usually has been a suboptimal tank. They did buff his ability a little bit, so maybe he's A tier, but in my experience, I found that he's B tier. Katarina also got buffed. She has slightly more attack speed now, so she should be stronger in the early game, but I don't know that this is enough to push her up in A tier when competing against some of these other AP item holders that exist in the 2-cost category. And then lastly, we have Jax here. In my opinion, just not that strong of an item holder. You're better off with some other options. If you're looking for a melee item holder, I think it's easier to just find many other options, whether it be Gnar, Olaf, Yasuo, Yone, Riven, etc. So unfortunately, Jax I don't think is that strong anymore. And that's sort of it for your early game headliners. Let's talk about itemization in patch 14.1. In S tier, we have 4 AP related items that all got buffed this patch. Adaptive Helm got additional armor and MR in the front row and additional AP in the back row. Morellonomicon got additional attack speed. Rabadon's got additional bonus damage and lost some AP. And then Ionic Spark got 200 additional HP added to the item. Now, Adaptive Helm in particular, in my opinion, is the best item in the game. You should always 100% of the time slam this. It's not only one of the best tank items, but it's also the best mana generation item on every single AP item holder in the game, with maybe the exception of Ahri where blue buff is better. Outside of this, Adaptive Helm is really good on Twisted Fate. It's really good on Karthus. It's really good on Sona. It's really good on Ziggs. It's really good on Vex. It does not matter who you put this on. It's going to be good. Morello is the best source of anti-heal. Rabadon's is the best AP item in terms of raw damage. And then Ionic Spark is better than Shiv in my opinion, although let me go ahead and move Shiv up here because Shiv is quite good. But Ionic Spark with that additional HP is a very good tank item. Now we move into A tier items. These are pretty good items, but not quite as good as S tier, or maybe they use some components that you might want to use elsewhere. Spear of Shojin, very good on Twisted Fate and Karthus. Nashor's Tooth I think is heavily underrated. I think it's excellent on every AP item holder. It's Biss on Ahri and Twisted Fate in my opinion. Very good on Karthus, very good on Ziggs, very good on Sona, very good on Vex. So this is just an excellent item all around. The only issue you might have with it is that it uses a belt, which again, Morellonomicon, very strong. Hand of Justice, very good on all of the melee holders in this particular meta. So you have Yasuo it's good on, Yone it's good on, Viego it's good on Akali. Less good on Riven, but outside of that, it's just a generally really good item. And you can also put it on your backline. So it's good on Twitch, it's good on Vex. It's actually surprisingly good stats on Twisted Fate as well. So just a really flexible item. Guardbreaker can be used on every single carry in the game. Great multiplier. Honestly, I think it's better than Giant Slayer. Let's go ahead and put these two together here. So Guardbreaker in this meta is better because you're playing around Twisted Fate and Karthus a lot, and those two units are hitting the backline as well as Akali, and even Viego is hitting the backline as well. So every unit that hits the backline and skips the front line wants Guardbreaker. Any unit that is full front to back wants Giant Slayer, but both of these are really flexible items. Gargoyle got buffed with 100 additional HP. It's fairly noticeable. Very good on Blitzcrank, very good on Amumu, and it's good on other tanks as well. Steadfast Heart remains the only way to make a tank item with Glove, therefore it's good. Dragon's Claw is good as a way to kill additional cloaks, although I will say Cloak is very valuable now that Adaptive Helm and Ionic Spark are so strong. So maybe this belongs more in B tier, but regardless, it's a good item. Archangel, just a worse AP item than Rabadon's in my opinion most of the time, but still very strong, belongs in A tier. Red Buff got nerfed, but still a great way to apply anti-heal. Thief's Gloves, still a great way to kill some extra gloves and get some good items on some of your other carries. And then Static Shiv, what's great about Static Shiv is that it applies MR reduction to the backline, which is really good for Karthus and Twisted Fate. Now we go into B tier. So the main issue with a lot of these B tier items are the components that they use, or they're a little bit weaker than these A tier and S tier items. So Warmogs is just as strong as some of these A tier items, but it uses 2 belts, and usually you want to use those belts elsewhere, such as Guardbreaker, Nashor's Tooth, or Morellonomicon. The main issue with Crown Guard is that it uses a rod, which is a highly valuable component in this meta. Redemption uses 2 high value components, which is belt and tier. Protector's Vow uses a tier, again, high value component. So all of these tank items are at least A tier or S tier, but the main issue with them is the components that they use. Bramble Vest is a little bit weaker in this meta since it's so AP heavy, although I will say it's good against all the melee carries that you see running around like Yone, Yasuo, and Riven. Quintu's Rageblade, really only good on Twisted Fate, Sona, Ziggs, and then maybe Twitch occasionally. So it's not quite as flexible as some other items, but because Twisted Fate is so good, it's a decent item. Jewel the Gauntlet is, in my opinion, worse than Archangel and Rabadon's when it comes to just pure AP damage. So it's down here in B tier. Then we have Hextech Gunblade. I actually think this, in terms of strength, is an A tier, but the main issue I have with it is that it's not a good first slam. So it really needs to be like your second or third item on a carry. If it's your first item, it's just not going to provide any damage, and that's sort of problematic. But the item did get buffed, and it is quite good. Even Shroud, I think, is better than Last Whisper and a little bit more flexible. Sunfire Cape, still a great way of applying anti-heal, but maybe a little less good than Morellonomicon, for example. And then Blue Buff has fallen off quite a bit because you no longer see Ezreal being that strong, and you no longer see Jhin being that strong, and as a result of that, really, it's just for Ahri, and Ahri is not as strong as she was before either. So we have found that Adaptive Helm and Spear of Shojin is a little bit better. Now we move into C tier. So C tier is not weak items necessarily. It's just more situational. So IE is really good on Yone, really good on Yasuo, a little less good on Twitch. If you go and look at the stats, the changes to Executioner actually made IE a little less good than it was before, but still decent overall. Just usually, in my opinion, there are slightly better AD items that you can build, with the exception on Yone and Yasuo. It's really good on those 2 units. Last Whisper, decent item for Viego, really good item for Twitch. Outside of that, you're not playing a whole lot of AD flex in this meta, so it's kind of fallen off. Deathblade, really strong item on Yasuo, surprisingly decent item on Yone as well, but outside of that, again, not playing a whole lot of AD flex. Also really good on Twitch, but that requires Twin Terror. Runon, same thing, not a whole lot of AD flex. If you do get this on Twitch or Lucian, it's very strong, but most of the time you're not going to be able to play either of those comps. QSS, in my opinion, really only has 2 units in the game that you want it on, and those 2 units are Yasuo and Riven. It's best in slot on Riven, and I think on Yasuo it's more optional, but still a decent item. Bloodthirster is, in my opinion, a little bit more situational than Hand of Justice. It's best in slot on Riven. It's not necessary on Yone, but can be good on Yone. And it's also, in my opinion, not best in slot on Yasuo, but again, can be good on Yasuo. And it's also good on Olaf, which some people have been playing, but a very situational item. Same thing with Titan's Resolve here. Situational, pretty much only goes on to Riven and Yone. I don't even think it's that good on Yasuo. And then Edge of Night, very good on Yone if you have GS, very good on Yasuo, and very good on Viego, very good on Akali, or decent on Akali. We're usually playing KDA Akali now, where it's a little less good, but still a pretty solid item overall. And then I have Sterix here in D tier. It's very good on Viego, but outside of that, I think it's a suboptimal melee item. So you're better off just building some of these other options if you have a sword. Twisted Fate is the strongest composition of patch 14.1. They made a lot of buffs to the various units in the comp, such as Nami, Taric, Gragas. There was a slight nerf to Echo. They buffed Lulu damage. They buffed Zac. They made a slight adjustment to Sona, so she's a little bit weaker than she was before. They buffed Twisted Fate. They buffed Ziggs. Overall, the composition got heavily buffed in this patch. They also buffed several of the AP items that this composition uses, which we showed earlier in the item portion of this video. So this is by far the strongest composition. What you're looking at here is a split between the core portion of the composition and the flexible portion of the composition. You're pretty much always going to be playing these 5 units on the left side here. So that's Twisted Fate, Nami, Gragas, Echo, and Blitzcrank. And then you're going to fill out the rest of the composition with these units on the right side. Most of the time, Taric makes it in because he's a very cheap addition, and he does always make your board stronger. And then you're looking to fill out with a Spellweaver, which can be either Lulu or Sona. Sona, of course, being better, but Lulu is perfectly fine until you're able to find her. Then you want a Bruiser. Usually it's going to be Alawi, but if you can't find Alawi, Zac is acceptable as well. And if you can't find Zac and you have Taric on your board, then Thresh is also an acceptable additional frontline unit. And then you want either Lux or Ziggs as a Dazzler, especially if you have Dazzler or Twisted Fate, so you can play 4 Dazzler on your board. Of course, if you have Lux, then you usually are going to want to pair that with Zac, and then you're going to want to upgrade those 2 units to Alawi and Ziggs as soon as possible. The ideal end game board is going to have all of the 5 costs. You're going to have Alawi, you're going to have Sona, and you're going to have Ziggs. And then you're not going to play any of these units that you see on the right side here. This is going to be the 9 units that you play on your board, and then your level 10 can be any 5 costs that you want, such as a Yorick. So lots of different options here in terms of what you can play, but that's the overall idea and philosophy behind building the composition. Let's talk about how you can itemize Twisted Fate. I have a list of every item that ideally should go on to Twisted Fate here, with the exception of Sunfire Cape, of course. When you search red buff, unfortunately it shows Sunfire, but all of these items can go on Twisted Fate, and then I separate it into 2 different categories. First, your Twisted Fate must have at least one of these items in his 3-item build. So Spear of Shojin, Adaptive Helm as your mana generation items, Morellonomicon is an excellent source of anti-heal, as well as just generally a good AP item. You have Nashor's Tooth, Archangel, and Rabadons as excellent AP items. You have Guardbreaker as an excellent multiplier, and then Hextech Gunblade as an excellent healing item. All of these items are excellent on Twisted Fate. They are his best items. They should always be in your 3-item build. Another thing I want to note here is that Spear of Shojin and Nashor's Tooth, they are bread and butter. They go together very well, and then you can pair it with any of these 3rd items ideally. Then we move into what I would say are more optional items here. So that would be your Giant Slayer, your Red Buff, your Jeweled Gauntlet, your Guinsoo's Rageblade, and Static Shiv. You might have seen a Twitter post that showed this as being best in slot on Twisted Fate. It is pretty good. The only thing I would say is that it's pretty much, you need to be able to supplement it with other options that I think generally are not going to be that available. For example, Zanya's is very good with Rageblade, but you're not going to have Zanya's every game. And for every game other than Zanya's, I tend to think that Nashor's Tooth is better. So I have Rageblade here in the less necessary category for building out your Twisted Fate. But generally, you're going to want to have some of these really good items on Twisted Fate, and you can also fill out with some of these suboptimal items if you need to. That's generally how I approach building Twisted Fate. Then we're going to go into looking at some of the different support items that you can have in the composition. Aegis of the Legion is the best item by far. Shroud of Stillness is very good as well. Zeke's is great. Chalice is great. Needlessly Big Gem is great because it's a stall composition. Then we're going to move into our Ornn artifacts. So you have Zanya's Paradox, insane on Twisted Fate. It's by far the best artifact that you can get. Diamond Hands is insane on Blitzcrank. Goldmancer's Staff, also very good on Twisted Fate. Anima Visage, good on Blitzcrank. And then Gambler's Blade is also acceptable on Twisted Fate. Although generally you're going to want to move this over to Sona eventually because it's actually not that great of an item on Twisted Fate overall. You can also go Death's Defiance on Blitzcrank, believe it or not, because the unit does do a lot of damage. It's actually surprisingly not that bad. And there are some other options as well, like Infinity Force, which is good on Twisted Fate, but these are the best artifacts that you can get in the composition. Lastly, we're going to look at augments here. So every single augment that you see in this list is good for Twisted Fate. I was able to filter this out using tactics.tools, and then I went and searched for each one of these. I have a mixture of silver, gold, and prismatic augments in here. I'm going to highlight a few options that are exceptionally strong. So Little Buddies, great on 3-2 and 4-2. Shopping Spree, very good on 2-1. Keepers is really good at all stages of the game, regardless of whether or not you get silver or gold. Spoils of War is really good, both silver and gold. Escort Quest is excellent. We also have Last Stand here, that's excellent. Stationary Support, all ranks of this are very good. All ranks of Uplink are pretty good. All ranks of Bulk are pretty good. You also have New Recruit for your Prismatics, that's very strong. So lots of different options here for all your different augments. I would recommend just kind of looking through this list here and getting an idea. Also, Crash Test Dummies is one of the best augments for the composition. So lots of different options here that you can go with for your augments, but these are specifically tailored for Twisted Fate. The other S tier composition of patch 14.1 is Twin Terror. It is pretty simple to play. You play 2 Amumus, 2 Twitches, 2 Vexes, 1 Pantheon, 1 Samira on level 8, and you have 4 Executioner, and you watch as your Twitch and Vex just blow up the enemy's boards within a couple of seconds. The way you play this is relatively simple in terms of how you approach it. So ideally, you only play this if you get Twin Terror on 2-1. You can also play it if you get Twin Terror on 3-2, but it's much better if you're angling it from the beginning of the game. You need to have Executioner Headliner on Twitch or Vex in order to hit 4 Executioner, and that's really it. On level 6, you're going to roll ideally until you find your Executioner Twitch, and are also able to find double Twitch, double Vex, Amumu, Pantheon, and Samira, so that you can have 4 Executioner Executioner and Amumu plus Pantheon in your front line, you're going to just quickly delete everybody. You're going to double trouble your Twitch. Everybody else is not going to get double troubled. By 4-2, you want to push to level 7, because if you're not level 7 by 4-2, you can't double trouble your Vex or your Amumu. In terms of which of those two you're supposed to double trouble on level 7, my personal assessment has been Amumu, but I saw a Precedent and a number of other good players say that Vex is better, so it's probably Vex. This is something that'll just come with experience here, but for now I'll just bet on Vex being a little bit better on level 7, but it could also be Amumu or whichever one you 2-star first. And then on level 8, of course, you're looking to play this board. Now, in terms of why this composition is so strong, well, it was strong last patch, and they also decided to rework the way 4 Executioner works. So they drastically increased the amount of percentage of critical strike chance that 4 Executioner provides, and they nerfed the damage component of it a little bit, the damage multiplier with critical hits, but trust me when I say it was a buff for the composition. Now, when it comes to itemizing Twitch, these are the different items that you're looking to put onto him. It's some combination of these items, again, with the exception of Sunfire Cape. When you search red buff, unfortunately, this shows up. Everything else here, though, is fair game. I've again split this up into 2 different categories. These are the must-have items. So these are the items you absolutely want to have on Twitch. That's Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Red Buff, Guard Breaker, Last Whisper, Runons, and Deathblade. If I'm being completely honest, ideally your build on Twitch is a combination of these 3 items, or sorry, a 3-item combination of these different items here. But there are some additional options you have that you can see right here. So Spear of Shojin, not really that great, but it's okay. You can put it on Twitch. Same thing with Hand of Justice. I've actually seen some builds with Guinsoo's Rageblade work, which is a little surprising given that this is more of a burst composition. I would guess that this only works if you have 3-star Amumu. And then you have Hextech Gunblade, which also has pretty good stats. But again, I don't think it fits the idea of the composition. The idea of the composition is to burst down the enemy board as quickly as possible. And I think that these items that you're looking at are a lot more likely to make that happen. So ideally, you build your Twitch with any 3 of these different items. Now we move into your support items. There's not a whole lot that are really good here. Aegis of the Legion, Zeke's Herald, and Chalice of Power are all very solid. I've played it with Zeke's Herald. It felt amazing. Chalice of Power sounds like it would be great as well. And then Aegis just seems to be strong in every single composition. When we go to Ornn artifacts, you have Infinity Edge, or Infinity Force rather. That's good, of course. Diamond Hands is great on Amumu. Sniper's Focus is decent on Twitch. You can also put it onto Vex. Gold Collector is an option for Twitch. And then lastly, you have Anima Visage for Amumu. And then when we come to our augments here, there's a lot of different options that you have. So all of this is tailored for the Twin Terror composition. Most of this is under the assumption, in fact, all of it is under the assumption that you took Twin Terror on 2-1. So you can practically ignore all of these augments on 2-1, because I pretty much would only play Twin Terror if you hit it on 2-1 for the most part. But outside of that, these are all really good options for 3-2 and 4-2. One commonality that I've found with all of these is that number 1, item augments are exceptionally strong. So you have Idealism here, you have Binary Airdrop, you have Buried Treasures on 3-2, not on 2-1. You have Lucky Streak, you have Lucky Gloves, you have Magic Wand, Radiant Relics, Lucky Gloves, all sorts of different item augments that are very good here. Outside of that, you also have some interesting options like Hologram. This will work with Double Trouble, so you'll duplicate your headliner and you no longer need to play a second Twitch 2. You now have a second Twitch 3, which is very strong. You also have Exposed Weakness here. I want to highlight this as just being the strongest augment by far. If you have Exposed Weakness with Twin Terror, you're probably going first. It's very strong, the 2 of those together. So lots of different options here in terms of what you can hit, and mostly you're looking for item augments, good combat augments, Exposed Weakness, and maybe like heavy hitters as well can be quite good. The next composition I'm showing is Akali Viego Karthus. This is just as popular as Twisted Fate, but I have not rated it as S tier, I've rated it as A tier. And the reason for why is because this struggles with single target damage against the Yone and the Riven compositions. So it usually struggles with killing those units. And since they are such a core portion of the meta right now, you're going to have a really tough time winning in those matchups. And I think that puts this at a lot less likely to win games compared to Twisted Fate. However, it's still very strong. It still has its place in the meta. It's still the most popular or second most popular composition that people play. On the left side here, we sort of have the main units that you're looking to play in most games. So we have the Superfan package with Lilia, Nico, and Gnar. You have your 3 main carries, which is Akali, Viego, and Karthus. And then you put your tank items onto Mordekaiser. Later on level 9, you can add a Vex to your board if you have Executioner, Karthus, or Akali, or you can add a Yorick to your board as well. These are excellent ways to cap out the comp. Usually you want to try to hit 7 pentakill if if possible. That's the best way to cap out. So if you have, for example, a pentakill Karthus or a pentakill Viego, adding this Yorick to your board will allow you to hit 7 pentakill. You can actually consider dropping out of the superfans with Lilia and Nico in the late game, and that will allow you to cap around some 5 costs such as Alawi. That's also an option for you for making the comp even stronger. Now when it comes to itemization here, these are the main items for Karthus. So you have some mana generation items in Spear of Shojin and Adaptive Helm. You have some healing items with Hand of Justice and Hextech Gunblade, and then you have a bunch of AP items here. I think the best way to build Karthus is 1 mana generation item, can either be Spear of Shojin or Adaptive Helm. Adaptive Helm is better, and then 2 AP items. So Rabadons plus Archangels, or Rabadons plus Jeweled Gauntlet, or Rabadons plus Morello. In my opinion, these are the best builds. You can also go Nashor's Tooth, which is quite strong, but in my humble opinion, the best build for Karthus is Mana Gen plus 2 raw AP items. Morello also has some very good stats. Now, when it comes to Akali and Viego, there's a lot of different ways that you can itemize them, so I've showed all of these different items here to just give you an idea of how flexible they are. Sunfire Cape, of course, is just from the bug where, unfortunately, when you search red buff on this website, it also shows Sunfire Cape, but all of these are pretty decent options for both Akali and Viego. One mention I'll make here is that Sterix Gauge and QSS are more Viego items and blue buff is more of an Akali item. Outside of that, all of these items can pretty much go on either one of the units. Then we go into support items here. So this is actually a composition where support items aren't all that good, and as a result of that, you're going to find that number one, maybe you don't want to play this as often if you get a support anvil from the portal. You should prioritize Aegis of the Legion. It's one of the best support items in multiple different compositions. It's the most flexible one. And then there's also Obsidian Cleaver here. This is very good on Akali. She will spread the effect on many different units. It's also decent on Viego, but it's definitely better on Akali. And outside of that, every other single support item really just isn't that great. So support items generally not that strong for this comp. For Ornn items, on the other hand, I've shown the 3 best ones. So Death's Defiance for either Viego or Akali, Infinity Force for any of your carries, and then Mana Zane for either Akali or Karthus. And then all of the different various Ornn items are actually quite good. So you can make use of Zanya's, you can make use of Hull Crusher, you can make use of the tank items. It really doesn't matter. You should really just pick whatever Ornn item is best for your particular spot because the composition is so flexible to so many different Ornn items. And as a result of that, some of the different Ornn portals, particularly Living Forge, is actually pretty good for this composition. So if I scroll down here, you can see Living Forge. You might be surprised to see that Stationary Support is actually pretty decent for this composition. That's really only on 4-2, and it's only the Prismatic one, because the Prismatic one provides you 2 support items. It's just generally a very strong augment, but outside of that, you're really not looking for those support items. When it comes to your different augments that you're looking for here, again, level 8 compositions, love to see Shopping Spree. Little Buddies is always going to be great with any superfan composition. Freaky Friday, you can make use of those Infinity Forces. Item augments in general are going to be quite good. Omnivamp augments are going to be good. Last Stand is always good. Remember Your Roots is surprisingly good. Metalheads, if you are able to play 7 Pentakill. New Recruit is good. Lots of different good options here. But again, this is filtered for particularly Akali, Viego, and Karthus, and these are some of the different augment options you might want to consider. Next up, we have Yone Reroll. So Yone Reroll is one of the highest cap compositions in the game, meaning once you hit everything, have all your items online, all of your augments online, you're going to be very strong and very likely to win out the entire game. But before you get to that point, you're going to struggle a little bit in a lot of games and maybe take a lot of damage in Stage 3 and Stage 4. So it's really all about stabilizing with Yone 3. Now, the core composition here is playing Yone, Mordekaiser, Zed, Viego, and Kayle. This will give you your 3 edgelord. And then beyond that, you're just looking to add a bunch of crowd divers. So your secondary carry is usually going to be Zed, since you can 2-star him. Of course, if you had 2-star Qiyana, you can of course carry that as your secondary carry as well. And then you're going to add a bunch of crowd divers. If you have crowd diver Yone, you can play 6 crowd diver on 8, which is fantastic. If you have edgelord Yone instead, then you can aim to add Riven or ideally Kayn on 8 and play around 5 edgelord. And then you can also decide to add an Echo occasionally to support with your Kiana and get Sentinel as well. But for the most part, you're looking to cap around either 6 Crowd Diver if you have the Crowd Diver Yone, or 5 Edgelord with 4 Crowd Diver if you have Edgelord Yone. And if you have Heartsteel Yone, tough luck. You're probably going to have to just stick with 4 Crowd Diver and 3 Edgelord, and then ideally eventually add a Kayn to your board. That'll give you 3 Heartsteel. Not that that really matters at that stage in the game, but that's probably how you would play it out if you had Heartsteel Yone instead. Now let's talk about itemizing Yone. There are a couple of different items here. This is the main list that I put together here. So Hand of Justice, Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, Titan's Resolve, Edge of Night, and Giant Slayer. The best in slot build that you're going to see most of the time on Yone is Infinity Edge, Dodge, and Titan's Resolve. However, you can also go Edge of Night if you have damage items to pair with that Edge of Night. So you can go Edge of Night, Hand of Justice, Infinity Edge. You can go Edge of Night, GS plus Hodge. There's a couple of different builds here. The main idea is that you want your Yone to have a certain amount of sustainability from Titan's Resolve and Edge of Nights, as well as Bloodthirster. And then you want him to have a certain amount of damage from Infinity Edge and Giant Slayer. That's the main concept here behind how you build him. If you have Gargantuan Resolve, then Bloodthirster double Titans is very strong on Yone, and that's it. I really would not put many items other than these 6 items onto Yone. You could also consider Deathblade potentially. Other than that, though, really it's just these main 6 items. Now we go into support items here. Practically every single support item is good with this composition, but I wanted to highlight a few of the broken ones. Banshee's Veil, you're going to notice that this is the strongest by far for all melee compositions, so we'll start off with that. You always snap that off if you get offered that as an option. Outside of this, these are the other top 4 rated support items. Every single support item is good in this composition with the exception of Needlessly Large Gem, because the fights are over before it procs. So generally speaking, every single support gem is good. These are the best ones. Never take gem if you can help it. Reforge gem if you get a gem randomly from, say, I don't know, one of your augments. All right, then we have our Ornn artifacts. Not a whole lot of options here. We have Death's Defiance and Infinity Force that are good on Yasuo, or rather Yone. And then outside of that, every other Ornn item is not really that strong. You can try to itemize Viego with some of the items. You can try to itemize Kiana with some of the items, or Zed. But for the most part, I would not take any Ornn items and put them onto Yone unless they're Death's Defiance and Infinity Force. Lastly, here we have augments. So a lot of different options here. I kind of want to highlight a couple of things. First of all, we already discussed the fact that support items are really good. So stationary support is quite strong, as well as support cash. And on top of that, we also have teaming up 1, not teaming up 2. I had to show both of them here, but it's only teaming up 1 that's good because it gives 2 random tier 3 champions, which can be quite good. A lot of the healing augments are good, so Harm Assist and Vampirism. A lot of the item augments are good. Jeweled Lotus is fantastic, especially later on in the game. Freaky Friday is good, as you might expect. Roll the Dice. Last Stand, I want to highlight that. That is by far the strongest augment that you can get on 3-2, and you'll be able to win out in a lot of games if you have Last Stand plus Yone 3. So definitely an auto take if you ever get offered Last Stand, but I recommend just sort of looking through this list. This is tailored specifically for having Yone 3. So these are some options that you might want to consider here. Next up, we have another melee-focused composition, which is Riven Reroll. It fundamentally differs from Yone Reroll in the units that you add to this core. So you still have the Viego, Mordekaiser, and Kayle, but now you're adding a bunch of 8-bit units with Riven, Garen, and Caitlyn. And ideally, you're going to have 8-bit Riven so that you can play 4 8-bit with just these 3 units, because you really don't want to have Corki on your board. 8-bit got buffed at 4 as well as 2, so you're getting a little bit more AD per stack, which is pretty relevant. And then you're going to fill out the composition with edgelords as well as some true damage units that have additional synergies. For example, you can play Senna for rapid fire for your Caitlyn. If you're playing her as a duo carry, you can add Echo in with Sentinel for your Mordekaiser, and you can add in Kiana to pair with a Yone eventually, which will give you Crowd Diver, and just generally speaking, Kiana is one of the strongest units in the game. Of course, you can also decide to add some edgelords with Kayn here. So lots of different options in terms of how to fill out the composition, but it's mainly these 6 different units, and then you fill out from some of the units on the right side here. Now, when it comes to Riven's itemization, she's relatively inflexible. There is a fixed best in slot, which is Bloodthirster, Giant Slayer, plus Quicksilver. You need to have crowd control immunity on Riven, otherwise you cannot play her. There are 2 other forms of CC immunity that you can get other than Quicksilver's that will allow you to replace this item. The first one is Banshee's Veil, which provides the same exact effect. And then you also have an augment called Indomitable Will, which will provide CC immunity for 10 10 seconds when your team gets a takedown. You cannot use Silver Veil as a replacement for QSS. This only provides crowd control immunity for the first effect that is applied to the unit in combat, and your Riven needs crowd control immunity for the first 18 seconds minimum. So this is not going to be good enough. So those are your main options there in terms of getting crowd control immunity. Outside of that, you're looking to build sustain and damage. Giant Slayer is very valuable because one of the ways that Riven gets countered is really strong tanks that she can't kill, so she can't get back to the backline soon enough. If you have Giant Slayer, she gets through those tanks a lot quicker, especially if you have an Even Shroud next to her in the form of Mordekaiser or Viego. And then lastly here, you can also go Hand of Justice plus IE. You would of course pair that with Quicksilver, or you can go Bloodthirster, Titan's Resolve plus Quicksilver. This is even better if you have Gargantuan Resolve. Otherwise, just stick with the best in slot build, Bloodthirster, Giant Slayer, and QSS. Very important that you build Riven correctly, otherwise she will not be strong. When it comes to support items, like most melee comps, every single support item is quite strong. Banshee's Veil is the strongest by far, but you also have Aegis of the Legion, Chalice of Power, and Zeke's that are quite good. Locket is good, Shroud of Stillness is good, Zephyr is good. The only two options that you don't want with Riven are Virtue of the Martyr and Needlessly Big Gem. And then we have the Ornn artifacts here. Death's Defiance and Infinity Force are always going to be the best for melee units. So when you're talking about Riven, these are the only two Ornn artifacts that I would put on her. And then lastly, we talk about augments. I already sort of showed them briefly before, but for the most part, it's pretty similar to Yone. So you still have Last Stand, you still have Vampirism, you still have a lot of support item based augments. You have Jeweled Lotus, which is probably the best augment on 4-2, Freaky Friday, which gives you 2 Infinity Forces. Remember Your Roots is sort of a new one here, so because you're playing mostly 8-bits and edgelords, this is going to apply to your entire team. And of course, Radiant Relics, if you're able to spike one of those items that I showed here as a Radiant, it's going to be quite strong. So those are your main different augments here. You can kind of take a brief look at this list to see what's good with Riven. The next melee composition I want to highlight is Yasuo Reroll. Now, just like Riven and Yone, he plays the same exact 3-unit package that we see with Viego, Mordekaiser, and Kayle, which again provides 3 pentakill and 2 out of 3 edgelord. Except now, instead of your third edgelord being Yone or Riven, it's now Yasuo. And then you pair this Yasuo with as many true damage units as possible until you're able to get up to 6 true damage. And that's the basic philosophy behind the composition. As a result of this, it's better to get true damage Yasuo than edgelord Yasuo because you already naturally get your 3 edgelord from Viego, Kayle, and Yasuo himself. Now, in terms of itemizing the different units, you're looking to itemize Yasuo, of course, as well as your Echo and your Akali, because these are true damage units. And of course, you can also itemize Qiyana once you're able to find her. Now, for itemizing Yasuo, there are 6 main options that you have available: Hand of Justice, IE, Edge of Night, Giant Slayer, Quicksilver, and Deathblade. You can also put Bloodthirster on Yasuo, but in my opinion, it's a lot worse than these options, especially if you don't build it with a lot of damage. So the fact that Yasuo has 10% Omnivamp from his headliner effect means that Hand of Justice is enough Omnivamp, and I think it's just better if you build this instead of Bloodthirster most of the time. Now, the standard build that most people do is Hand of Justice, Infinity Edge, and Edge of Night, but you can also build around Deathblade, Giant Slayer, QSS, Hand of Justice, IE, QSS, GS, Hand of Justice. There's a lot of different combinations here that work. I recommend looking at tactics.tools, but the main idea here is that you're looking to build out from these 6 different items. Then we go into the support items here. So Banshee's Veil, again, any melee composition, this is going to be the best support item that you can get. You also have Zeke's, Aegis, and Locket that are quite strong. Outside of this, unlike Yone and Riven, most of the other support items are not that strong, but again, they're all acceptable. They're just not as strong as these 4. And then lastly, again, you do not want Needlessly Big Gem because this is another burst-based composition. The fight's going to be over before that gem is able to proc. Then we go into our Ornn artifacts. There's one additional Ornn artifact here. You can put Gold Collector onto Yasuo. It does have decent stats. It's a little surprising that it has good stats because Yasuo already has a built-in execute from his bling bonus. However, one fundamental difference between Yone, Riven, and Yasuo is that Yasuo does a lot of single target damage, and he's really all about killing units one at a time, whereas Riven and Yasuo, or Riven and Yone, have a little bit more cleave and kill multiple units at once. So I think this Gold Collector is better when you're doing focused single target damage like Yasuo does. Now we go into augments here. You're going to see a lot of similarities between these augments and the Yone and Riven augments. Some differences I want to note here. Number 1, Live for Danger. This was something that was not in the Riven and Yone lineups for the augments. augments, but it is here for Yasuo. I think a major reason for that is because it provides you a Yasuo from the augment itself. So if you need a Yasuo, it can be quite good. Outside of that, you're still seeing the normal stuff. Not today, very strong here because you do want to have Edge of Night on both Yasuo and even your Akali. It's quite strong on. Of course, your healing augments are still quite good. Your CC immunity augments are good. Pandora's items is quite strong here again because you need very specific items on Yasuo, and those items are also contested with Akali, who's your secondary carry. So by taking Pandora's items, you can guarantee that you get BIS for both of them. A cut above is very strong if you have an early Yasuo that you get to play around. You can farm a lot of gold with this, and Deathblade is quite strong on Yasuo himself. And in fact, I think that's part of why the Deathblade stats for Yasuo are pretty good. So lots of different options here. Really, it's just about guaranteeing that you get really good items. Last one I want to mention here is Blinged Out. This is specific to this particular composition and is quite good. Next up, we have Country Reroll, which has been around since the start of the set. It's still exactly the same. You have these 7 core units where you're playing the 4 country units of Tahm Kench, Thresh, Urgot, and Samira. Ideally, you get Headliner, Country, Samira, and then you fill out the composition with Set, Amumu, and Vex. And then now, because Country Emblem is makeable with Spatula plus Cloak, you can in fact play 7 country on level 8 by adding in this Katarina, and it is quite strong. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is that this composition requires a lot of gold, so you should stay on level 7 for most of the game unless you get this country +1. But if you don't hit the country +1, you should stay on level 7 trying to roll for your 3-cost 3 stars. Now when it comes to itemization on Samira, it's pretty inflexible. You have 6 main options here: Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, Last Whisper, Runons, and Deathblade. You have to have Infinity Edge on Samira, at least one of them, and then for your remaining 2 items, just pick any 2 from this combination here. The best in slot build is Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Last Whisper. You can also go double Infinity Edge plus GS, double Infinity Edge plus Last Whisper, double Infinity Edge plus Deathblade, so on and so forth. But the main idea here is that you need to have an Infinity Edge, and then you can combine any combination from these remaining 6 items as you please for the last 2 items. Now, Urgot items and Vex items are a lot more flexible. Just slam any AP items you can onto Vex. One thing I want to mention about Urgot in particular, though, is that Bloodthirster and Titans are heavily overrated, and you are much better off going for damage items on Urgot. So just keep that in mind. So Deathblade is really good, Runons is really good, Red Buff is good, Edge of Night is surprisingly good. There's a couple of other options that I'm struggling to think of. Oh, Giant Slayer is good, Guardbreaker is good. So just try to build damage onto Urgot rather than Omnivamp and survivability, because he's pretty safe here in the back row here. Plus he gets some Omnivamp from Mosher anyway, so you really just want him to do additional damage. Then we have our support items here, so Aegis, Chalice, and Needlessly Big Gem are all good in the comp. Outside of this, there's really not that many good support items, so generally speaking, you're going to try to stay away from portals that provide those, or from augments that provide them. Then you were going into Ornn items. There are tons of different Ornn items that are pretty good here, but the main ones are Zanya's, Infinity Force, Tricksters, and Gold Collector. Gold Collector is best in slot on Samira, so if you're able to get this, just slam it on Samira. You're very happy. The other options are pretty solid as well, so Trickster's Glass can go onto Urgot. That's probably the unit it's best on. You can also put it on Vex or Thresh for additional CC, and then Zanya's Paradox is really only good on Vex, but it's quite good on her. And then Infinity Force is just a flexible item that you can throw onto either Vex or Urgot and is quite good. Now we move into the augments, so lots of different good options here. The main thing I want to focus on in terms of the philosophy of picking augments for this comp is there's 2 main things. You want either econ augments or item augments. If you're going to pick a combat augment, it needs to be very powerful. So for example, Three's a Crowd is a combat augment, very powerful with this comp. Exposed Weakness is a combat augment, very good for this comp. Outside of that, you're going to see that most of these different augments are focused on items or gold. So Escort Quest, econ augment. Spoils of War, econ augment. Infernal Contract, econ augment. Roll the Dice, that's an item augment. Portable Forge, item augment. Binary Airdrop, item augment. Scrappy, Iron Assets, Buried Treasure, Dazzlers, so on and so forth, right? Lucky Gloves, Component Buffet, Overwhelming Force, Unleashed Arcana. There are so many different item augments for this comp because it's very difficult to itemize all of your 3-cost 3-stars. So item augments are very strong, and econ augments are very good as well because they help you hit the composition. Now, of course, you're not going to go for econ augments that give you XP because you're looking to roll on level 7. So that's mainly what these various different econ augments are for, right? These are econ augments that help you roll on level 7 to hit all of your 3-stars. Another fun composition I want to show here that is sort of new is this too big to fail bruiser composition. So you only play this if you get too big to fail, mostly on 2-1, and you're looking to play 6 bruiser plus Twisted Fate in the backline with ideally either Nami or Ziggs for the second Dazzler. You can also play around Karthus and Yorick as well for a 3 pentakill with an AP item holder Karthus, but Twisted Fate seems to be the carry of choice if you're looking to play this augment. It's relatively new, the idea of this composition, and I don't think it's really been fully explored yet. I really don't fully understand yet how it works in terms of how strong it is. I've played it myself a couple of times. Sometimes it felt good, sometimes it felt bad. I've played against it. Sometimes it felt good, sometimes it felt bad. Feels like a very middle of the road. It is quite strong if you're able to get to this 6 bruiser line with Twisted Fate plus Ziggs, but it can be quite difficult to get there. So just wanted to mention it as an idea. If you're looking to play something a little bit different, pick up this augment, try out 6 bruiser with Twisted Fate plus Ziggs in the backline. Lastly, I want to go over a couple of different compositions quickly that aren't as good as some of the other comps that I've already covered, or are compositions that are fairly situational. Starting off with 7 KDA Ahri plus Akali. This is a fairly strong composition if you're able to hit it, but it does require hitting 7 KDA, which means that you do need to have a KDA headliner. And it also is much stronger if you're able to have a KDA spat, so that you can replace this Kai'Sa with a Karthus with KDA emblem. This has been around for a while. Personally, I think it's too situational to be able to hit most of the time, but it is decent when you do hit it. Unfortunately, it doesn't win out all that often. Then we have Annie Reroll. This is the old version of Annie Reroll where you would play 3 Superfan, and there is a new version of Annie Reroll that is apparently a little bit better. I haven't played it yet, but this is where you play around 4 Emo. So now you have higher unit quality because you're dropping out of those Superfan, particularly Kennen and Lilia, and you're replacing them with Poppy plus Amumu. The rest of the board is practically the same, and you get to play around 4 Emo, higher unit quality, better tanks, and you get to have 4 Emo, which is very strong for Annie. Then we have Superfan Jazz. This is an old comp from the very beginning of the set. If you get that Jazz baby, it's pretty decent. You have new items for Bard, particularly blue buff plus Rabadons, which have been buffed a lot from the start of the set. And then, of course, the same build as always on Misfortune. And then you're looking to eventually get Nico 3 as your primary tank, as Echo has been nerfed, and he's also usually harder to hit. Then we go to Jax. So Jax got nerfed pretty heavily in terms of the frequency of his ability cast, which is quite noticeable. This is only played if you hit Zhonya's off of an artifact anvil very early on. So by stage 2-1, if you hit it, then you know that you can tailor for Jax. If you are somebody who's not looking to force Twisted Fate, maybe because you see a lot of other players are angling for Twisted Fate, then you can go for Jax. Again, only viable if you have Zhonya's for the Jax. Otherwise, I would not play this. Then we have 6 Emo Karthus, though this is only possible if you have an Emo spat, but this is roughly how the build works out. You play 4 Executioner, 6 Emo, Poppy is your primary tank. Once you find Yorick, the comp is very strong because you get Mosher for your Poppy, which is quite impactful. And of course, this gives you 2 out of 3 pentakill. So when you level up, you just add a pentakill unit to your board, and you'll have a very, 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 very strong board if you're able to get to this point. It's pretty difficult to get to this point, unfortunately, so I've been able to hit it twice, and I was very strong. I came second place in both of those games, and I would have went first in both of them if the person I was fighting against didn't have like Golden Egg or some crazy win condition. It's very strong, so I wanted to highlight it in case you're able to get an early Emo spat. And that's it for patch 14.1. There's a lot of different things that we covered here. Hopefully it was very helpful for you. Make sure you check out my Twitch for my live streams if you're interested. I also have a subscription thing where if you sub to my Twitch or if you sub here on YouTube via the joining my channel membership, there's some perks that you can get in my Discord. Make sure you check that out if you're interested. See you next time.